This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
In this episode of Rewilding in Action, I continue my chat with Professor Steve Carver about the IUCN's 5 rewilding guidelines, as well as what distinguishes passive rewilding from other types of rewilding. Topics include how important is ongoing monitoring in rewilding, and should we be aiming to preserve nature to an historical biodiversity target? And how can humans be part of a rewilded world? For every rewilding project, planting natives is needed in some places. For example, for seed islands, property boundary planting, and low flammable green firebreaks around buildings. Today's episode of Rewilding in Action is supported by Ribbonwood Nurseries that's based in Dunedin. I've planted hundreds of their trees, shrubs and ferns, and been very happy with how well they've grown, as well as the knowledge and the friendliness of the owners and staff. You can contact Ribbonwood Nurseries through their website at ribbonwoodnurseries.co.nz or call them on 03 453 4673. Kia ora, ko Maureen Howard, toka ingoa. Another deep dive into rewilding is in store for you in this episode. This is the second of 2 conversations about the IUCN CEM guidelines for rewilding. That's the Commission on Ecosystem Management of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. My guest via Zoom for this episode is Professor Steve Carver, who's the leading author of this IUCN report and who is a geographer and Professor of Rewilding and Wilderness Science at the University of Leeds. This episode is going to make a lot more sense if you've already listened to the first part of this interview with Steve. That's episode 35 of Rewilding in Action. And I apologise for the quality of the recording of my voice in this episode. I think I need a technology upgrade for the episodes that I do from home. In our previous conversation, episode 35, Steve and I discussed the first 2 guidelines for rewilding. Guideline 1, Rewilding is nature-led, functional ecological restoration, and Guideline 2, Rewilding aspires to large-scale restoration through landscape-scale planning and collaboration across time and space. In this episode, I'm kicking off our conversation by asking Steve about Guideline 3. So Guideline 3, which is what we were hoping to talk about in part today, was rewilding is informed by evidence and requires ongoing monitoring to inform adaptive plans. And I like this because a lot of people think that rewilding is just about letting nature go and walking away and not paying any more attention. So what were you hoping to get across with this guideline?
Basically, that when you allow rewilding to take place, things happen. And you're not necessarily on top of what's going to happen. Things will surprise us. And so that requires an element of monitoring. Now, there is some external forces acting on any area. So if you're trying to rewild an ecosystem, then you need to monitor that process. Problems like non-native invasives, so that requires monitoring. You need to see what's happening in the system. And essentially, by allowing a landscape to rewild, you're allowing natural succession to take place. And there will be disturbance mechanisms within that. And, there are a number of paths that an ecosystem can go down depending on the edaphic conditions, soil, climate, topography. And in a shifting, changing, dynamic world, there are a number of possible paths. So I think it's important to be able to monitor that process. And then if things start to happen, which, I always use an example of non-native invasives. If suddenly you get a problem, the system has been overtaken by whatever it is. I mean, in the UK, it's African 3R, Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed. There are big 3 non-native invasive plants. They're very spectacular plants, but they don't belong in our system.
Yeah.
And they could easily take over in certain ecosystems. And so that requires monitoring and intervention, stepping in and intervening if necessary.
And then, so it's quite interesting then the distinction between that, where you are intervening to, let's say, remove an invasive species, and perhaps being open then to an ecosystem emerging that wasn't quite what you expected was going to happen.
Yeah. Somebody once said, I can't remember who it was now, that ecology isn't more complex than we think, it's more complex than we can think. Some things are relatively predictable. Natural succession of an ecosystem is relatively predictable, but there will be these apparently chaotic or stochastic random effects, which we can't necessarily predict in advance. And that's why monitoring and adaptation in that planning is really important. But the critical thing is we're doing it with a reference ecosystem in mind. Now, because of climate change and a whole bunch of other factors, those reference ecosystems, it's not possible to go turn the clock back and go back to those. But you are using that knowledge about what species and the patterns of those species should be in a landscape with a given set of edaphic conditions, the soil, the climate, the topography. Had the disturbance, the change in the ecosystem not occurred, in other words, us, removing forest or planting non-native species, agriculture, etc. That's your reference ecosystem.
Right. It's quite tricky,
acknowledging
isn't it?
that it is very tricky. Everything is changing, but it is history. History is an important subject because it tells us we learn from the past, and ecology is the same. We learn from past ecosystems what happens under certain circumstances or what should be there in a particular set of conditions. And acknowledging that climate change is this overriding global change, acknowledging that we still need to have those reference ecosystems of which we judge the success of a rewilding project.
Right. So it's really as a reference rather than a sort of a dictate.
Yeah, rather than a target as such. It's a reference to say, oh yes, this is what would be here had we not come and messed it up.
So we'll move on to guideline 4, which ties in quite nicely. Rewilding embraces dynamism and systems thinking. And I really love this guideline because it really shows us how ecosystems are changing, and perhaps we've relied on things being a little bit too static.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of conservation, fortress conservation, you recognize as an important ecosystem, or its habitat for a particular species, which is, endemic or it's globally rare or whatever. And we manage it to keep it like that. And that holds nature in the kind of state of arrested succession because you're trying to keep that ecosystem like it was for when it was first designated. And nature's not like that. Nature is dynamic, if nothing else, and it wants to change succession towards an ecological climax, whatever that is. And it might never reach it because of a series of natural disturbances, whether that's, storms or floods or, in extreme volcanic eruptions and things which can wipe the slate completely clean. And then it starts over again. So it's nature trying to fill a space with the maximum biomass and maximum diversity it can over a given time period, or an open-ended time period. And it's that temporal change which takes into account both the external and the internal dynamics and forces in an ecosystem.
Yes, it's quite cool because then even within that ecosystem, you'll get ebbs and flow of species as they boom and bust, and being able to stand back perhaps and just say, actually, it's all going to go the other way, so we can just relax. And it's a bit hard for us humans to do.
But it's not just ecological systems that we're talking here, and this are the biophysical environment. This overlaps with the social economic, and that's where the system thinking comes into play, I think. Yes, ecosystems, obviously, it's in the clues in the name, are systems, but then overlaid on that, and it might not so be overlaid geographically on the top of, but it might be around the edge and therefore has an important impact, is that socio-ecological system. as well. Humans are important because of our impact on ecosystems, our demands on them, the benefits that we get from natural ecosystems. Don't forget, ecosystem service delivery and all of that. Plus that sort of moral, ethical standpoint, which says, we are kind of at the top of the food chain, but maybe we need to change that dynamic into a value system that values natural species, not just for what they deliver for us, but for their own intrinsic value.
So that then ties us also into the final guideline, which is rewilding is place-based and participatory. And that is where I would have put what you've just said about it being an interaction between humans and nature, that participatory aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these 5 guidelines, they all neatly segue into each other. You can't separate out some of these things too much, but everything happens in space and time. Everything is context specific. So that's what I say about it being place-based. So what's good for one location might not necessarily be the same for another. The overriding principles and ideas are, but the actual interventions on the ground, the changes that we'll see, the species that would naturally be found in a particular place at a particular time will be very, very specific to that location. And so reinstating ecological integrity and rewilding an ecosystem needs to be balanced with the human element around it. As I said before, rewilding doesn't exclude people. It very much involves people, because if local communities are not on board and supporting it, it ain't going to happen. So there's a very strong participatory element in this. And, I've done research in my career on developing web-based GIS tools, spatial mapping tools for use by the public, because the public and local people, indigenous people, are this huge wealth of knowledge about place. Because they live there, they've spent all their lives there. That their parents and their grandparents and all the rest have spent their lives in that place, and therefore know it intimately. So this is that where the place-based participatory element is really important, because it gets people involved, and so building up that knowledge from the ground up about a landscape is really important.
Steve and I talk about the differences between passive rewilding and active rewilding. Quite a lot of my episodes have been about passive rewilding, as I see it, which is relying on natural succession to restore our ecosystems and only intervening where we have to. So not bringing in bigger animals and stuff, but it's more a matter of fencing out the stock or eliminating a pest and letting nature take the way.
We talk about passive rewilding, active rewilding. I don't necessarily think they are completely separate. There's a continuum. They blend into each other. There's rewilding projects which are more on the passive side, and those which are more on the active side, and then there's elements in between. And you just mentioned a lot of passive projects in New Zealand, but you then said, but we would intervene if there were non-invasive species, or you're fencing out livestock or whatever. So that's an intervention. And therefore you might say, well, okay, that's kind of active. You're not just turning your back and walking away. You're fencing it off to keep the livestock out. You mentioned non-native invasives. That's an intervention. So you might say that there are elements of active rewilding within a passive rewilding approach.
Right. Yes, I see what you mean. So it's a continuum then between the passive and active.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the number of interventions that you're taking.
Yeah. And so I wrote a book chapter a few years back now for an early book on rewilding, which is, I was asked to write about land abandonment, which is essentially passive rewilding. But in writing the chapter, I kind of tied myself in knots in the first edition of it, trying to sort of talk about passive rewilding. Couldn't do it. So I ended up drawing a little time graph. It was a cartoon graph. It wasn't based on real data, but it had intervention as the vertical axis, and it had time as the horizontal axis in an independent axis. And I drew a series of lines representing different types of rewilding. So entirely passive rewilding would just be a flat line along the bottom, zero intervention, no change, just walk away. But a lot of rewilding projects may involve an early element of intervention. So if it's premeditated rewilding, if you like, you start with a high level of intervention and get the ecosystem back onto its feet. And then over time, you tail off that intervention, such as you end up with zero or minimum intervention going forward. Other systems, it might be passive rewilding happens because of something. I mean, Chernobyl is the classic example. Everybody had to get out because of the nuclear accident at Chernobyl, and nature going, woohoo, great, the humans are all gone, we can do what we want. But then over time, people are going, well, we could reintroduce this species into this new protective area. And so there's been this sort of uptick of intervention, and then again tailing off again. So yeah, these graphs, albeit they're cartoon graphs, they do indicate that it's not an either or, and over time there might be different requirements for different levels of intervention.
Right. So I'll take the example of Hinawai Reserve, where by fencing out stock and removing ungulates, they have what I would see as kickstarting the process to allow natural native forests to regenerate, and then only intervening minimally as when needed to remove certain invasive weeds and so forth. And so I thought that was passive rewilding because it was focusing on that following natural successional processes rather than bringing in species.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this is the classic definition of rewilding. You're giving nature the space and the time to dictate its own trajectory.
Yes.
But initially, you've put a fence in, you've taken some livestock out, and some non-native invasives, perhaps. I don't know, some non-native tree species or whatever. So that's an intervention to begin with, and then you've rapidly tailed off.
Yes.
So you've set the project up to then allow nature to take.
It's really removing those human influences that have prevented the ecosystem from actually recovering itself.
I would definitely put it more towards the passive end of the spectrum, but there are, acknowledging then that there are still some interventions.
Yes, and I think for Hugh Wilson at Hinawai Reserve, a big factor is he wouldn't reintroduce species because that would be intervening in nature's processes. Because I know in the UK and in the Northern Hemisphere, reintroducing species is such a big part of kind of completing that ecosystem. And for us in New Zealand, we can't bring back our moa.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, the UK, like New Zealand, is an island, and we've lost all of our wolves and our bears and our lynx. They've been extirpated from our landscape. If we're going to bring them back, we're going to have to make a decision to actually intervene, so it's active, to put them back in our landscape. They're not going to come back on their own because of, this English Channel, 20 miles of water between us and the continent. If it didn't exist, they would be here already.
It brings us in then to trophic rewilding, just so that people can understand the difference between active rewilding and trophic rewilding.
Well, trophic rewilding is a sort of an offshoot of the active rewilding, if you like. You're reintroducing a keystone species which has been missing in an ecosystem to try to create those top-down controls on other species, habitats, etc. And the classic example everybody talks about is Yellowstone and the wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone. They'd actually already started to come back on their own, but scientists and ecologists thought, we need more wolves in Yellowstone. And it's probably been a bit overblown in terms of the evidence, but there's definite evidence there which shows that returning the wolf has had an effect, in that you've got a missing large predator, pack animal in an ecosystem. The behavior of the prey species changes, and the behavior and populations of mesopredators, the smaller predators, changes in the absence of that top level trophic control of the wolf. You reinstate the wolf, and you're then creating a intergill predation pressure on mesopredators, And so in Yellowstone, without the wolf, the coyote was the sort of top mesopredator. And so returning the wolf suddenly made the coyotes a lot warier, and they were no longer top dog, literally. And it changed their population dynamics. It changed the behavior of elk in Yellowstone because they were no longer able to graze without fear, reintroducing that landscape of fear. Yes, some of them got killed by the wolves, but it changed the behavior of all of the others because of their, suddenly going, oh, there's this big dog around, and it's chasing us. And we didn't have that before. So it changed the behavior of the elk. It then had an impact on recovery of woodland, tree species in the park. So it's had an impact. And, some people say it's changed the courses of the rivers because, more bankside vegetation, because the elk weren't grazing freely next to the rivers, because when they're next to a river, they're trapped. They can be easily cornered. And so they're avoiding those areas now because of the wolves. That's allowed the beaver to come back. And of course, the beaver's an ecosystem engineer, and it changes, that then changes the course of the river. And there are other examples of these top-down controls where a keystone species has been lost, and when it's been reintroduced, it then cascades all the way down through the system.
It would be really interesting to see what would be the situation here in New Zealand. And there are efforts, to bring back species, our kakapo and kakahe. Mm-hmm. These are small herbivores that would have had some impact on the landscape, but unfortunately we can't bring back our really big moa.
No, the moa's gone and the horse eagle's gone, and there's no bringing those back, I'm afraid, regardless of what Colossus Project, or whatever it's called, says.
Well, look, we'll have to close off. There's so many things we could talk about in terms of rewilding. It's such a growing and science and way of conservation. I was just wondering, have you had much feedback from putting out the 5 guidelines, or even, your definitions and the work that you've been doing that's helped clarify it for people?
I think it's mixed. I mean, yes, it's helpful to frame exactly what rewilding is. And, in some institutions, governments, etc., they really do need that because they hear a lot about rewilding and, the latest craze in conservation, what have you. And it's helped bottom out exactly what it is, as well as what it isn't. I remember the first time that I presented the 10 initial guiding principles at a conference in the UK, and I was the last person on this 3-day conference. I was the closing act, and so everybody's there in the lecture theatre. And I start talking through these 10 principles of rewilding, and it starts to go quiet. And I'm thinking, oh, this isn't going down very well. What's the problem? And I realized what I was saying is that these guidelines, these guiding principles, they're going, well, we're not doing that. Oh, no, we can't do that. Maybe we're not rewilding. Maybe we're doing something else. And I think this is the thing, is that most projects in the UK, for example, I would put in the bracket of ecological restoration or regenerative agriculture. They're not really rewilding. They're doing something else. Nothing wrong with that.
The wonderful thing about rewilding is it has ignited this nature-led approach, and a lot of different ways in which people are grabbing at it and taking it and making it their own.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that rewilding has kind of like turned conservation around and on its head. Fortress conservation was always like, oh my God, what's happening? We've got to protect the last bits here, and it's all doom and gloom. Rewilding says, no, we can turn the ship around. We can reverse the fortunes of wild nature and create space for more. And so that's the critical thing. It is a positive approach. It's an optimistic approach. And it says we do have a future.
Thanks again to my guest, Steve Carver, for another fascinating and informative conversation. I'm really interested to see how the IUCN guidelines for rewilding help rewilding develop as a science in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think Guideline 5 in particular, that rewilding is place-based and participatory, is critical. I see it giving permission to us to practice rewilding here in Aotearoa in a way that's tailored to our unique conditions, with many functionally important extinct species and a high level of endemic species, many of them on the brink of extinction. Thanks for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard. If you think others might enjoy this episode, please share it. In my next episode, I'm out on the Otago Peninsula to talk to Sean and Helen Murphy on their property about their rewilding actions that have benefited some very special invertebrates and the important functional role that invertebrates play in ecosystems. Until then, I will leave you with the recording, details in the show notes of the European robin, another UK species that's loved by my guest, Steve Carver, a rewilding researcher who's letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.